Last time we saw Xie Lian, he left the Heavenly Realm in a dashing manner. Let's find out what happened to him next. For anyone new here, in this series I go through Heaven Official's Blessings novel, Donghua, and Manhua, sentence by sentence, scene by scene, and explain what the Manhua and Donghua changed, added, or removed, and explain how this affects the story. Okay, without further ado, let's dive into it. After Xie Lian left in a dashing manner, 3 days passed. In the book, we get some exposition. It explains the beauty of the scenery and that the tea master would sit outside and observe everything when there weren't any customers. This makes the world feel more lived in. Then the Donghua follows the novel. Xie Lian walks by, then halts, and backs up. In the novel, he comments on the tea shop's name. Small Shop of Chance Encounters. That name is what makes him stop. And it is true. In the shop, he will meet Fuyao, Nanfang, and Huacheng's butterfly. In the Donghua, he doesn't comment on the name, but it is clear that he stops because of it. And then the Donghua has a very strange change. In it, Xie Lian is completely fine and looks pristine. In the novel, it is the opposite. He is described as very tired, travel-worn, like he had walked for a long time. However, even though he appeared tired, his expression was a cheerful one. So much so that one watching him couldn't help but lift the corners of his lips too. That last part is important, because from it we start to understand why Xie Lian was so popular back in the day. In the manhwa, Xie Lian is definitely shown as travel-worn. However, it doesn't show why Xie Lian stops at this shop, and it shows the tea master looking surprised, having the opposite reaction than in the novel, where he couldn't help but smile after seeing Xie Lian. In both adaptations, Xie Lian simply walks in and orders tea, and we don't find out how he got here and why he was so tired. In the novel, before entering, Xie Lian asks if Mount Yujun is nearby, and the tea master says yes. Hearing that, Xie Lian let out a breath and managed not to let out his entire soul while he was at it. He thought to himself, "I finally made it." Turns out, when he left the Heavenly Realm in such a dashing manner and jumped down dashingly, his sleeve was caught by a dashing cloud. He tumbled and landed God knows where, and had to walk for 3 days to get here. I love the writing of this book. This scene isn't exactly that important to the plot, but it is funny and shows Xie Lian's bad luck, so I'm sad that both adaptations cut it. Feature me here. Later in the manhwa, Xie Lian does comment that he fell because of a cloud, but it doesn't have the same effect as in the book. Then the Donghua adds some dialogue. Xie Lian asks the tea master if there is anything weird happening recently, and the tea master answers, "Speak no evil, see no evil." In the novel, Xie Lian orders tea and then sees a wedding procession outside. This is not the same procession that we see in the Donghua later on. In this one, people were weeping, full of grief, fury, and terror. The tea master looked at it before shaking his head and moving on. So, even though the Donghua cut out this procession, it did keep the tea master's reaction by adding this dialogue, showing that people here choose to look away when something bad is happening. The manhwa just cuts the procession and doesn't add anything in its place. Then, in the book and both adaptations, Huacheng's butterfly appears, and here I don't like how the Donghua handled it. In the book, the butterfly lands on Xie Lian's finger, but in the Donghua, it completely ignores Xie Lian, even though he extended his hand. Those butterflies absolutely adore Xie Lian. There is no way it wouldn't take the opportunity to rest on Xie Lian's finger. In the manhwa, it does land, so a rare W for the manhwa. In the novel, we get Xie Lian's inner monologue, and I think it's cute. He describes the butterfly as incredibly intelligent, beautiful, and serene. He hasn't even met Huacheng yet, but he is already praising his butterfly. Also, in the book, when the butterfly leaves, Xie Lian waves at it as a farewell, which is also adorable. And then the Donghua makes one of the most bizarre changes that I really dislike. In the Donghua, after the butterfly leaves, Lingwen contacts Xie Lian and tells him that 2 junior officials from middle court came to help him. He turns around, sees how displeased they are, comments that they look like they came to behead him instead of helping him, asks if Lingwen tricked them, but gets no reply. And then Xie Lian asks them, "So, you are?" They give their names, and Xie Lian says that he wasn't asking for their names. He wanted to know for what god they worked. When I first watched this, I had to do a second take. This was completely out of character for Xie Lian. We were told that Xie Lian was different from other gods, that he valued people, not their status, and here he is displeased when someone said their name instead of who they work for. I began rethinking Xie Lian's entire character at this point. Turns out, in the book, that interaction was completely logical. After the butterfly leaves, Lingwen does not contact him. Instead, he turns around and sees two random guys sitting at his table, looking very displeased. And it is here when Xie Lian asks, "You two are?" And instead of an explanation, Nanfeng and Fuyo just give their names. Here, it is logical that Xie Lian didn't want their names. He wanted to know why two random people were sitting here looking at him like that. And even then, Xie Lian doesn't say that out loud. "I wasn't asking for your names" was a thought, not something said out loud. And only then does Lingwen contact him to inform that they are two general officials that came to help. Why did the Donghua change this? I have no idea. I understand cutting or changing things for time or if they don't transfer well to a more visual media. But here, there is no excuse. Moving on, we get more exposition in the book. Upper and middle courts are explained. The heavenly officials in the upper court are the ones who actually ascended, and there are only around 100 of them. So Xie Lian, Muqing, Fengxian, Windmaster are all from the upper court. Officials in the middle court are the people that are brought to heaven. They do not ascend themselves. An example of this would be Muqing and Fengxian when Xie Lian brought them with him during his first ascension. So, there is upper and middle courts. Is there a lower one? The answer is no. There are only two. During Xie Lian's first ascension, the middle court was actually called the lower court, but officials didn't like the sound of the lower court. It made them feel lesser, so they changed the name to middle court. Xie Lian, seeing that these two volunteers look very unhappy, says to Lingwen that they don't look like they're here to help me work, more like they're here for my good-for-nothing head. And in the book, we get an explanation why Lingwen didn't answer. She didn't randomly ghost Xie Lian. Xie Lian's spiritual powers ran out at this point, so communication was impossible. Then Xie Lian thanks the two for coming. The two only nod, giving quite the attitude. And from that, Xie Lian deduces that the two must serve quite the distinguished martial gods. He gets them tea and asks them which gods do they work for. They answer Nanyang and Xuanzhen, and the Donghua does an excellent job of portraying Xie Lian's emotions. In the book, he thinks, "Well, this is certainly horrifying," and gulps down his mouthful of tea. Him spitting the tea out into Donghua only helps to show how he feels. Xie Lian asks if their general sent them, and in the book they answer in unison, which shows us that those two idiots share a single brain cell. Then Xie Lian thinks for a moment and asks if they know who he is. This isn't explained in the Donghua, but he asks this because he is worried that if Nanfeng and Fuyo were tricked by Lingwen, then they would get scolded by their generals for helping him. They answer, and Fuyo, rolling his eyes, is completely book accurate. In the book, we get a little more exposition telling us that Fengxian and Muqing never got along, and in the past, while serving Xie Lian, they only held back because Xie Lian told them to get along and be good friends. But now, even their believers hated each other and saw each other as enemies. After those two idiots say, "I am willing," in unison, we get Xie Lian's inner thought in the book. Looking at those two grim and dispirited faces, Xie Lian thought inwardly, "You guys actually meant I want to kill myself, right?" So, as we can see, apart from the bizarre change and cutting some exposition, the Donghua was pretty much identical to the book in this scene. Let's look at the manhua. And the manhua continues its tradition of cutting like 90% of the book. After Xie Lian asks who they are, Nanfeng and Fuyo immediately say their names and under which general they work. I mean, this doesn't have the problem that the Donghua had, but it cut out Lingwen, cut out the funny interaction, and Nanfeng and Fuyo look normal, when they should look completely annoyed. And Xie Lian has zero reaction to finding out that they are Function's and Mu Qing's subordinates. He should look horrified. Why is he so calm? Why are all three of them so calm? Compare the emotions in the Manhua and in the Donghua. At least Fuyao still rolls his eyes. But Nanfeng's and Fuyao's bickering is cut out. After Nanfeng says yes, kick him out, Fuyao doesn't say anything. At the end, we do get some emotions out of them, so that's good. This entire conversation felt extremely dry in the manhwa. Moving on, the ghost groom explanation in the book and the Donghua is pretty similar. In the book, it was a bit more descriptive, saying that the first time it happened, they couldn't find a single piece of the bride. But the second time they found a half-eaten foot, and that even though 17 brides went missing, thousands of brides made it perfectly fine, so no one really made a big deal out of it. The only thing was, there were now fewer families willing to marry their daughters into this area, and the locals didn't dare to make a big show of their weddings. That was all. And fun fact about the Lord, whose daughter was taken and who finally got through heaven. He even opened up his stores to feed the poor. When a rich person starts donating to the poor, you know they are desperate. The only thing that the Donghua cuts out here are some interactions between Xie Lian and Xie. In the book, Xie Lian assumes that the two already know the situation, but they say nope in unison, and only then is Xie Lian forced to explain the entire thing. And when he finished, the two looked very uncooperative and looked like they didn't listen to a word Xie Lian said. So Xie Lian was ready to explain everything again when Nanfeng asked his question. Another interesting detail is that Nanfeng drank the tea that Xie Lian bought for him, but Fuyao completely ignored it, choosing to clean his fingers with a white handkerchief the entire time. And his comment is toned down a bit in the Donghua. In the book, he asked his question coldly and it felt more like an attack. Your Highness, how would you know that it must be a ghost groom? Aren't you a little too quick to judge? In the book, it says that the three talked for a bit more and that Xie Lian was relieved that the two junior officials were actually quite sharp. The Manhua, for some reason, moves this conversation to the Nanyang Temple. They just randomly get up and leave the tea shop to go there. The explanation about the ghost room is cut down even more than the Donghua, but enough information is left to understand what is going on. Then, Nanfeng's question is completely cut and only Fuyao asks a question. In the book, both of them asked something to show that they both listened and had thoughts on the matter. And the manhwa completely removes Fuyao's attitude. We are no longer in the tea shop, so we obviously don't see him not drinking the tea. And I don't know if it's a translation problem, but when he asks his question, he says, how can they say it's a ghost room? Isn't their conclusion a bit rash? In the book, he specifically said, you, targeting Xie Lian, and only then did Xie Lian say that it was the palace of Lingwen who actually came up with the name. Here, it seems that Fuyao is simply asking a logical question instead of attacking Xie Lian. And here is when both adaptations decide to give me a headache, because both of them decide to change things, but in completely different ways. The whole thing with Xiao Ying and the procession that we see in the Donghua does not happen here in the book. It does happen later, but not here. After the conversation, they go to the temple in the book. Also, in the Donghua, the tea master gives them directions, but in the book, someone else does that. But before any of that happens, there is a very funny and a bit depressing scene in the book that both adaptations cut out. The three decide to find a place to sleep, and Xie Lian heads out, but stops when he realizes that the two are not following. Xie Lian was puzzled, but the two were bewildered. Nanfeng asked where Xie Lian was going, and Fuyao was rolling his eyes. Turns out Xie Lian was heading straight for the wild bushes. We learned that Xie Lian often camped out or slept on the streets, so he was ready to find a cave to sleep in. Only after Nanfeng's question did Xie Lian realize that they can sleep in any Nanyang or Xuanzhen temple. And they don't ask the tea master for direction, they ask the Lord of Soil and Ground. This deity's little shrine is completely broken down and forgotten. And when he wakes up after Xie Lian calls for him, he is completely blinded by Fuyo's and Nanfeng's spiritual light. The Lord of Soil and Ground is actually scared of all three of them and is trembling, showing that heavenly officials are way above him. He quickly finds Nanyang's temple and vanishes. Xie Lian places some coins at his shrine and cleans it. This is actually quite sad, because Xie Lian knows what it's like to have your temples abandoned. While he was doing that, Fuyo was rolling his eyes so hard that Xie Lian almost wanted to ask if his eyes were tired. I'm so sad that the adaptations removed Xie Lian's sass. In the book, the Temple of Nanyang is described as extraordinarily lively, with people going in and out, so it's weird that both adaptations have it completely empty. In the book, we get more exposition. Because heavenly officials don't really show themselves to mortals, their divine statues in temples tend to be very, bad, especially in poorer towns. It is stated that not even their mothers could recognize them from their statues. They themselves oftentimes cannot recognize themselves. One exception being Muqing. His statues are very accurate and tasteful. Why, you might ask? Well, Muqing kept destroying the ugly statues of himself until they finally started making good ones. That's hilarious. I love that. In the book, when the three enter the temple, Fuyo spends 2 whole hours criticizing Function's statue. The Donghua cuts this completely, and the Manhua only has one comment later on. Now that I think about it, both adaptations really water down Muqing's and Fuyo's character, which is sad because Muqing is a very complex character in the book. In the book, that's when Xiao Ying enters the temple, and Xie Lian uses this opportunity to change the topic and stop Fuyo's rant. He comments that it is strange that Function has such a big following in the north. The Donghua completely removes Xiao Ying from the scene. Remember, in the book, this is the first time we are seeing her. The Donghua made the procession happen earlier than it did in the book and blended Xiao Ying's 2 appearances into one. Also, in the Donghua, Xie Lian originally wanted to find Mingguang's temple and keeps saying how weird it is that there isn't one. This doesn't make sense. At this point, they are searching for a place to sleep. They wouldn't go to Peiming's temple for that. They specifically wanted Function's or Muqing's temples. So, in the book, the fact that there aren't any Mingguang temples around hasn't been brought up yet. Then, we get more world building in the book. Heavenly officials have domains. For example, Peiming is in charge of the north, and Function is in charge of the southeast. This is because most of their followers are in these areas. Also, a heavenly official's spiritual power would be unleashed to the max on their own turf, and this was the main domain advantage. Only someone like the Heavenly Emperor didn't have a main domain and was worshipped all over. So it was actually very impressive that Function had a big following in the north. Nanfeng should have been proud, but that wasn't the case, and we soon find out why. This interaction is the same in the Donghua and the book. However, what Fuyo is saying is different. In the Donghua, Fuyo says, "Is it about the naming of Nanyang Temple?" In the book, he says, "You must be wondering why there are so many female believers coming to worship." And then we get more exposition. Usually, fewer female believers pray to martial gods. The only exception was Xie Lian during his first ascension. A lot of women prayed to him. The reason? 2 words. Good looking. I want you to think about it for a moment. Xie Lian is canonically so good looking that he is the only martial god who got lots of female believers. Basically, Xie Lian had just ascended, so the sculptors still knew how he looked and they were highly skilled. And because of the line, Body and Abyss, Heart and Paradise, there were flowers in his temples, and Xie Lian got the title, the flower-crowned martial god. So, women liked coming to his temples to pray. Function's statue in the temple was far, far away from good looking. But there were more female believers praying than there were male. And Nanfeng looked very uncomfortable. So Xie Lian's curiosity only grew. That's when Xiao Ying finished praying and stood up. Like I said, there is no Xiao Ying in the scene in the Donghua. Part of this interaction was moved to the procession incident. I will cover how the Donghua handled it when we get there. For now, let's look at the Manhua. The Manhua completely cuts out the female believers and their conversation. When they finish discussing the ghost groom, Xiao Ying appears. The interactions between those three and the Manhua are really dry. In the manhua, Fuyo randomly turns, sees her face, and exclaims, "Chu ugly." In the book, Xie Lian is the one who points her out, and only then does Fuyo look at her. In both versions, Xie Lian chides him, saying that you cannot talk about girls like that. And can we stop and talk about the BS of this scene? In what universe is this considered ugly? And why did the book decide to pick on this girl? It says that the girl's face was incomparably flat, like someone had slapped her face into a pancake. Rude. However, Xie Lian didn't point her out because she was ugly. He pointed her out because he saw that her skirt was torn. Xie Lian telling Nanfeng to not be nervous is in both versions. The dude is scared of women. Xiao Ying's prayer is also the same. In the manhua, Xie Lian immediately takes off his robe and throws it on her, but in the book he first asks Nanfeng and Fuyo, "What do we do?" Fuyo says not to ask him and that she didn't pray to his general, so it's not his problem. And Nanfeng was rendered mute, his blood raining from his face, completely helpless. The dude is really afraid of women. Seeing that the two idiots are useless, Xie Lian then decides to throw his robe on her. We do see Nanfeng crouching and Fuyo looking away, but it would have been nice if they kept this interaction. Xiao Ying being very confused and taking off the robe is the same. But in the book, when all of this was happening, Nanfeng and Fuyo were frozen, useless however you wanted them. Seeing this, Xie Lian sighs and then goes to help the girl. And Xiao Ying was rightfully scared because this is how it is described in the book. That girl, Xiao Ying, only saw a blur before her eyes, and the man suddenly emerged from the darkness, reaching out to her with his upper body bare, and she was scared out of her wits right then and there. Also, in the book, she screams "harassment" when she slaps Xie Lian. Seeing that slap, Nanfeng and Fuyo felt the side of their face twitch at the same time. And here the man who actually expands the scene a bit. In the book, Xie Lian stuffs the robe into her hands and whispers something. Xiao Ying turns red with tears welling in her eyes and runs out with the robe. I really like that in the manhua, Xie Lian covers her when she crouches down. It feels more sincere and warm. Then, again, the dialogue stays mostly the same, but it lacks character. In the manhua, Fuyo just asks, "Who did you fight with?" But in the book, this question is a demand. Star Amber really could have played around with Fuyo's expression to convey his emotions. In the manhua, Xie Lian explains the cloud situation since it wasn't mentioned before. But in the book, Xie Lian looks at them blankly and simply says, "I fell on my own," which is hilarious. Imagine this from Nanfeng's and Fuyo's perspective. Xie Lian is covered in wounds, and the only explanation he gives is, "I fell." Fuyo even starts grumbling. Then the two see Xie Lian's cursed shackle. I like the reaction here. And here is where the manhua starts cutting stuff again. After this, they immediately start talking about the ghost room again. But in the book, this is not the case. Xie Lian figures that seeing the cursed shackle is making the two feel uncomfortable. So he tries going outside, but Fuyo stops him with an eye roll, saying that if he went out looking like that, he'd be called a pervert. Nanfeng then finds Xie Lian's sublight attendance robes to wear. Then Xie Lian asks if the two want to read the scroll again, and the two bicker. Fuyo calls the scroll worthless, and Xie Lian feels sad for the ashen-faced junior civil officials at the Palace of Lingmen who put the scroll together. They are really overworked. And then Fuyo brings the conversation back to why Function has so many female believers. Seeing this, Xie Lian got a headache and put the scroll down. He decided that if they weren't going to focus on real business, then why not see what the side business was all about? And this is where the Donghua rejoins the chat. The Donghua keeps the bare minimum of the Dikyang situation, but it is enough to understand what is happening. In the book, Function's original title was Juyang, which meant perfect masculinity. But one time, the emperor decided to demonstrate his faith and sincerity, and he personally drafted the titles of every temple. But he spelled Juyang not as perfect masculinity, but as gigantic masculinity, which is a euphemism for a certain giant body part. The people obviously saw it as a mistake, but were too afraid to tell the emperor that he was wrong. So they decided to say nothing and make it Function's problem. They made the right decision, because when the emperor saw the mistake, Instead of correcting it, he invited countless scholars to find him quote-unquote proof that giant masculinity was actually correct. Function didn't notice this for decades. He only realized something was wrong when women started praying to him, the kind of praise that made them blush. After Function figured it out, he charged to the peak of the ninth sky and shouted his curses to the scorching sun and the vast skies. But he couldn't do anything. It wasn't like he could pick on those women who were praying so sincerely, so he forced himself to listen for many years. Poor guy. Finally, a decent emperor came along and changed the title to Nanyang. But the damage was already done. Fuyo then helpfully recites a little poem about Function and his masculinity. That's when Nanfang tells Fuyo to go sweep the floor. And we get more exposition in the book that was cut from the Donghua. Basically, it expands on what is already said in the prologue. When Muqing was still Prince Xie Lian's servant, he did various chores, and that included sweeping the floor. One day, Xie Lian saw him silently reciting training incantations while sweeping. Xie Lian was moved by Muqing's dedication to learn and persuaded the Gouashi to take him as a disciple. Like, any sane person would be grateful for this, but Muqing had taken this as the humiliation of his life. Oh, Muqing. So basically, Muqing and every martial warrior under his command would flip out whenever they heard the word sweep. And Function would flip out whenever he heard gigantic masculinity. They really do share a single brain cell. The Donghua does have Nanfang and Fuyo say that your general used to serve Xie Lian. She gives some context to why Fuyo reacted this way to the word sweep. But it does get rid of the fact that Xie Lian showed incredible kindness to Muqing and he took it as humiliation. Then the dialogue stays faithful to the book. The only thing changed is that the Donghua adds back some of Muqing's and Function's backstory that is previously cut out, saying Xie Lian took them to heaven with him, but they turned their backs on him later on. This is important information, so it's better late than never. Then the two start fighting in both versions, but in the book, instead of standing there, Xie Lian actually goes to sit in the corner. I don't know which is funnier, him just standing there and getting hit, or him going to sit in the corner to wait the fight out. In the book, the steamed bun actually rolls to his feet instead of him catching it, so Nanfang's reaction and Fuyo's disgust is more understandable. Then in the book, when Xie Lian says, firstly, he says the same thing as in the Donghua, but then adds, I don't think your generals would ever behave like this. If you two act so indecorously, you'll ruin their reputation. When those words were spoken, the faces of the other two changed to something indiscernible. Let's be honest, all three of them knew that that was a lie. Function and Muqing throw hands and insult each other very often. The second point stays the same, but in the Donghua, it looks like they are unwillingly agreeing. But in the book, their expressions looked like they were saying, listen to you, dream on. And in the book, Xie Lian says a third thing. Good. Now thirdly, the most important thing. If you must throw something, then please throw me instead of food. Love it. And in the book, Nanfang actually digs out the steamed bun out of Xie Lian's hand at this point, because Xie Lian was still planning to eat it. Nanfang looked like he couldn't take it anymore. If it's fallen to the ground, then don't eat it. In the Donghua, they then move on to talking business again. But in the book, they actually sleep for the night and then return to the tea shop the next morning. So, to recap, the Donghua moved the procession to happen earlier and merged Xiao Ying's two scenes into one, and for some bizarre reason, tried to assassinate Xie Lian's character in that one scene. But other than that, it followed the book very well. The Manhua kept Xiao Ying's scene in the temple, but cut an absurd amount of scenes. It toned down Fuyo's and Nanfang's characters, especially Fuyo's. It removed 90% of their bickering, even cutting out the part where they accused each other's generals of leaving Xie Lian, which is kind of important for their characters. And it cuts out the gigantic masculinity part, which isn't all that important to the plot, but is very funny. Also, I will cover this in part 3, but the Manhua completely cuts out this procession. Next time, we will talk about how the Manhua keeps cutting out Xie Lian's badass scenes. But if you haven't guessed it already, I am done for this video. I really wanted to at least finish episode 1, but it is what it is. See you in part 3. Bye!